The night I arrived at the house, the sky was swollen with dark clouds, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and decay. The road leading to the estate was long and winding, cutting through an overgrown forest where the trees seemed to lean in, whispering secrets among themselves. The air was heavy with moisture, thick with something else I couldn't quite name, a sensation that made my skin prickle with unease. My car's headlights barely cut through the fog that curled around the old iron gates, rusted and barely holding onto their hinges. With some effort, I pushed them open, the screeching metal echoing through the silence like a warning. The house itself stood like a specter in the darkness, looming, watching. Its silhouette was jagged against the storm-laden sky, its many gabled roofs casting deep shadows. The windows, tall and narrow, were dark and vacant, like the empty eye sockets of a skull. As I stepped toward the front door, the wind howled through the trees, making the house groan, as though it was breathing. The moment my fingers touched the handle, a deep sense of wrongness settled into my bones. But I had nowhere else to go. I turned the knob, and the door swung open with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of aged wood, dust, and something more elusive, a faint trace of rot lingering beneath it all. The entry hall stretched before me, the wallpaper peeling in long strips, revealing the skeletal wooden framework beneath. A grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister polished smooth by time, but the steps were coated in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed by any sign of recent life. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking in protest beneath my weight. I had come here to claim my inheritance, a house left to me by a relative I had never met. The letter had been formal, sparse on details, merely informing me that the estate was now mine. No explanation of who had lived here before, or why it had remained abandoned for so long. But standing in the dimly lit corridor, I could feel the weight of years pressing down on me, as though the house itself was aware of my presence and waiting for something to happen. A sudden sound cut through the silence. A soft creak, like the weight of a footstep on old wood. My heart pounded. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows. The house was empty. It had to be. The lawyer had assured me of that. Still, I felt a presence, unseen but undeniable, pressing in around me. I moved forward cautiously, pushing open a door to my left. A sitting room, the furniture draped in heavy white sheets, ghostly forms frozen in time. A fireplace yawned dark and empty, soot stains streaking the stone like old blood. The air was colder here, the dust undisturbed, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible. My breath caught. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence stretching on and on. I shook myself, forcing my mind to stay rational. Old houses creaked. The wind howled through cracks in the walls. The mind played tricks in places like this. I needed rest. I would explore the rest of the house in the morning. I found a bedroom on the second floor, the bed frame still intact though the mattress sagged with age. As I set my bag down, a sudden chill spread across my skin. I turned slowly. The hallway beyond my door was darker than before, as though the shadows had thickened, pressing in closer. And then, from somewhere in the house, the whispering returned. Closer this time. More distinct. A voice, low and urgent, yet unintelligible. I barely slept. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. The whispering came and went, just at the edge of hearing, always seeming to come from just beyond my sight. When the morning light finally broke through the heavy curtains, I felt no relief. The house, in daylight, was no less foreboding. The shadows still clung to the corners, and the silence was thick, expectant. I moved through the rooms, searching for any signs of what I had heard in the night, but found nothing. No footprints in the dust. No open windows or unlocked doors. And yet, I knew I had not imagined it. In one of the upstairs rooms, I found a study, lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of forgotten tomes. A desk sat in the center, its surface coated in dust. But one spot, directly in front of the chair, was clean. As though someone had sat there recently. My stomach clenched. I reached out, hesitating before brushing my fingers against the smooth wood. The moment I did, a deep shiver ran through me, and the whispering returned, right behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The room was empty. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. The air around me grew heavy, thick with something unseen. The door slammed shut on its own. My pulse pounded as I stumbled back against the desk. And then, the bookshelves groaned, as though something pressed against them from the other side. The whispering turned to ragged breathing. I could feel it now, something standing just inches from me, something unseen but undeniably there. I bolted. The door flew open before I reached it, as though the house was letting me go. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gulping in the cold, damp air. The house loomed behind me, watching, waiting. I had thought I was alone in there. But I wasn't. Something lived in that house. Something that had been waiting for my arrival. And as I stood there, heart pounding, I knew, whatever it wasn't finished with me yet. I stood outside, gasping for breath, my hands trembling as I gripped my car keys so tightly that the metal bit into my palm. The house loomed behind me, silent now, as if it had swallowed its whispers, waiting. The early morning light did little to soften its ominous presence, and despite the fresh air filling my lungs, I could still feel the weight of whatever had been inside with me. I should have left. I should have gotten in my car and driven away, never looking back. But something held me there. A sick curiosity. A pull that I couldn't explain. The wind stirred the overgrown grass around me, and the rusted gate creaked slightly as it shifted. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation, the dust, the long-abandoned rooms had made me imagine things. I could go back inside, just for a little longer, to prove to myself that there was nothing lurking in the dark corners, that the whispering had been nothing more than my exhausted brain misinterpreting sounds. My inheritance was inside that house. And despite the dread curling in my stomach, I needed to know why I had been given it. Slowly, I turned back toward the door, the wooden steps groaning beneath me as I climbed them. My fingers hovered over the handle, hesitating. The air felt heavier here, as though the house itself was aware of my return. Bracing myself, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Silence. The hallway stretched before me, unchanged. The dust remained undisturbed. The shadows clung to the corners, deep and still. I forced myself to move, each step deliberate. I made my way back to the study, my heart hammering as I approached the desk. The air was frigid here, colder than the rest of the house. The clean spot on the wood was still there, untouched. I reached out again, my fingers barely grazing the surface. A breath. Right against my ear. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The room was empty. But the air was charged, electric with something unseen. The whispering returned, no longer faint, no longer distant. It was close. Surrounding me. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that sent ice through my veins. My chest tightened, panic clawing its way up my throat. And then, one word. Clear. Distinct. Run. I obeyed. I didn't stop until I was outside again, stumbling down the steps, nearly falling into the damp grass. My car was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, my heart pounding. Nothing. The engine refused to start. I tried again. And again. The car remained dead. A sound drifted from the house, a slow, deliberate creaking. Like footsteps. My head snapped toward the doorway. The door, which I had left open in my panic, was now swinging shut on its own. Not slamming. Just closing. Gently. As if something inside wanted to keep me out. Or worse, keep something in. I scrambled out of the car, my mind racing. I needed to get away. If the car wouldn't start, I would have to walk. The main road was a mile away. I could make it. I had to. I turned toward the gate, but something caught my eye, movement in the upstairs window. A shadow. A figure. Standing perfectly still, watching me. My breath hitched. I couldn't make out any features, just the dark outline of a person. And yet, I knew, deep in my bones, I was not looking at something human. It raised a hand. Not in a wave. Not in greeting. It pointed. At me. I ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted away from that cursed house, my lungs burning with each desperate gasp of air. The overgrown path leading to the main road was uneven, littered with twisted roots and jagged stones, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Behind me, I swore I could still hear that slow creaking noise, the whisper of something unseen just beyond my reach. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a sound that made my stomach churn. It wasn't the wind at all. It was laughter. Faint, distorted, stretching into the night like fingernails dragging across stone. I didn't dare look back. Branches slapped against my arms, the cold air tearing at my exposed skin as I pushed forward. The old iron gate loomed ahead, rusted and barely standing, the only barrier between me and the rest of the world. I reached for it, my fingers curling around the freezing metal, and pulled with all my strength. It groaned in protest, rust flaking beneath my grip, but it wouldn't budge. No. No, no, no. I threw my weight against it, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. It was stuck. I turned, scanning the path, my heart hammering in my chest. The house stood in the distance, its windows dark, its roof sagging under years of decay. And yet, something shifted. A movement in one of the windows. A shadow. Watching. Waiting. The laughter grew louder. My pulse roared in my ears as I yanked at the gate again, this time with enough force that the rusted hinges snapped. The gate swung open, nearly throwing me off balance, but I didn't stop. I tore through the gap, stumbling onto the road. The pavement was rough beneath my feet, but I kept running, my body screaming for rest. I had to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. A car. Headlights in the distance. I threw up my arms, waving frantically. The vehicle slowed, its beams cutting through the fog that clung to the trees. Relief flooded through me as the car rolled to a stop, the driver's side window lowering. A man, middle-aged, graying at the temples, peered out at me with concern etched into his face. "You all right there, son?" he asked, his voice calm but wary. I nodded, breathless, my hands still shaking. "Please," I gasped. I need to get away from here." The man frowned, glancing toward the road behind me. "Where'd you come from?" I hesitated. How could I explain? How could I tell him about the whispers, the figure in the window, the gate that wouldn't open? The fear was still thick in my throat, clogging my words. He must have sensed something in my expression because he nodded and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in." I didn't need to be told twice. I yanked the door open and slid inside, the warmth of the car wrapping around me like a blanket. The man put the car in gear, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror before pulling onto the road. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to look back. I didn't want to see if the house was still watching me. The silence stretched between us for several miles before the man spoke again. "You came from that old place, didn't you?" I stiffened, my fingers tightening around my knees. My voice wavered. "It was my uncle's house. I inherited it." The man let out a low hum, tapping his fingers against the wheel. "Figures. That place always finds a way to bring folks back." A chill crawled up my spine. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. "You ever hear the stories?" he finally asked. I swallowed hard. "No." He exhaled sharply. "Thought so. No one ever tells M. Not the full truth, anyway." His grip on the wheel tightened. "They just let the house sit there. Rot. Let it do what it does best." I turned to him, dread curling in my stomach. "And what's that?" His knuckles whitened. "Wait." A shiver ran through me. The man didn't say anything else after that, and I didn't press him. The silence inside the car was thick, suffocating. But I wasn't sure if it was the weight of his words or something else entirely. We drove for what felt like hours before he finally pulled into a gas station at the edge of town. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the pavement. "This is as far as I go," the man said, shifting the car into park. "You got somewhere to stay?" I hesitated. I don't know." He sighed, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a few crumpled bills. "Get yourself a motel room," he said, pressing the money into my hand. "And whatever you do, don't go back there." I took the money, my fingers brushing against his rough palm. "Thank you." He nodded once, then looked at me with something close to pity. "I mean it," he murmured. It doesn't let go easy. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air wrapping around me like a second skin. As I watched him pull away, a sick feeling twisted in my gut. I didn't know what he meant. Not yet. But I would. Because even as I stood there, miles away from that cursed house, I could still feel it. Watching. Waiting. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Story 2. The first time I heard the whispers, I told myself it was just the wind. It was late, the kind of late where the world feels like it's holding its breath, and the only sound was the faint creak of the old house settling into its bones. But then it came again, a soft, insistent murmur, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I froze, my fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. The room was dark, the kind of dark that feels alive, pressing in on you from all sides. I strained to listen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever was making them knew I was listening. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and expectant, like the house was waiting for me to do something. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after too many late nights and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The house had always felt off, ever since I moved in. It was too big for one person, with its high ceilings and empty rooms that seemed to echo even when I walked softly. The realtor had called it charming, a fixer-upper with character. What she didn't mention was the way the shadows seemed to move when you weren't looking, or how the air always felt colder in certain spots, like you'd stepped into an invisible pocket of winter. I'd laughed it off at first, chalking it up to the quirks of an old house. But now, lying in bed with the whispers still ringing in my ears, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I made coffee, the familiar routine grounding me as the sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. But even in the daylight, the house felt different. The shadows were sharper, the silence more pronounced. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners. By midday, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and left, telling myself I just needed some fresh air. But as I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Every passing car, every pedestrian, felt like a potential threat. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the whispers lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. When I returned home that evening, the house was waiting for me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. I hesitated on the threshold, my hand gripping the doorknob like it was a lifeline. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than usual. I forced myself to step inside, my footsteps loud in the silence. The whispers started again as soon as I closed the door, faint but unmistakable. This time, they weren't coming from the walls or the ceiling. They were coming from the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. The basement had always given me the creeps, with its damp concrete walls and the faint smell of mildew that never seemed to go away. I'd avoided it as much as possible, using it only for storage. But now, the whispers were calling me, pulling me down into the darkness. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, the click of it echoing like a gunshot. The single bulb flickered to life, casting a weak yellow light over the stairs. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they knew I was coming. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The whispers were coming from the far corner, where the shadows were deepest. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The light from the bulb didn't reach that far, and I had to squint to see what was there. At first, it looked like nothing, just an old wooden crate covered in dust. But as I got closer, I realized there was something inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as I reached out to lift the lid. My fingers brushed against the rough wood, and for a moment, I hesitated. Whatever was inside, I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. But the whispers were unbearable now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from inside my head. I lifted the lid. The crate was empty. I stared into the darkness, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. And then, from behind me, I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I turned slowly, my body moving as if it were no longer under my control. The light from the bulb flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. It was crawling toward me, its body twisted and broken, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Its mouth opened, and the whispers came again, louder and more desperate than before. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the thing dragged itself closer. Its fingers clawed at the concrete, leaving deep gouges in the floor. And then, just as it reached me, the light went out. I don't know how long I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. When the light finally came back on, the thing was gone. The basement was empty, the crate closed as if I'd never opened it. But the whispers were still there, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I knew then that whatever it wasn't going to let me go. And as I climbed the stairs, my legs trembling with every step, I realized something else. The whispers weren't just in the house anymore. They were inside me. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the whispers have grown louder, more insistent. They follow me everywhere, a constant reminder that I'm not alone. I've tried to leave the house, but every time I get to the door, something stops me. It's like an invisible force, pushing me back inside. I've stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The shadows in the house are darker now, more alive. I see things moving in the corners of my vision, shapes that disappear when I turn to look. And the whispers, they're not just whispers anymore. They're voices, real voices, speaking in a language I don't understand but somehow know is meant for me. Last night, I found the crate again. It was in my bedroom, sitting at the foot of my bed like it had always been there. The whispers were deafening, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction. I knew what was inside, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened it. And this time, it wasn't empty. Inside was a mirror, its surface black and oily, like it was made of liquid darkness. I reached out to touch it, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from the mirror, I heard my own voice. It was calling my name, over and over, each time louder and more desperate. I wanted to look away, to close the crate and pretend I'd never seen it. But I couldn't. The voice was too familiar, too real. And then, just as I was about to scream, the mirror shattered. I woke up this morning with shards of glass scattered across my floor. The whispers are gone, but I know it's not over. The house feels different now, like it's alive, watching me, waiting. I don't know what's coming next, but I know it's going to be worse. And as I sit here, writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Something is here with me, something that's been here all along. And it's not going to let me go. The silence after the mirror shattered was deafening. For a moment, I thought the whispers had finally stopped for good, but I was wrong. They returned, softer now, almost like a distant echo, but they were there, lurking in the corners of my mind. The house felt heavier, as if the walls were closing in, and the air was thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of the past few days was getting to me, but deep down, I knew better. Something was in the house with me, something ancient and malevolent, and it wasn't going to let me go. I spent the day cleaning up the shards of glass, my hands trembling as I picked them up one by one. Each piece seemed to catch the light in a strange way, reflecting images that weren't there, faces twisted in agony, eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the unease in my chest grew with every passing hour. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. The thought of closing my eyes and letting the darkness take me was unbearable. Instead, I sat in the living room, the TV on but the sound muted, my eyes darting to every shadow that moved. It was around midnight when I heard the first knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone was testing the door to see if I was awake. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my eyes locked on the front door. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I wanted to believe it was just a neighbor, someone who needed help, but the rational part of my brain knew better. No one came out here, not at this hour. The house was isolated, surrounded by woods on all sides, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I stayed silent, hoping whoever, or whatever, was out there would go away. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the door with both fists. I don't know what made me do it, but I got up and walked to the door. My hand hovered over the knob, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and I realized it wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of sound. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, screaming at me, demanding something I couldn't understand. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been outside was gone, but I knew better. The house felt different now, darker, more alive. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing like living things, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I knew I couldn't stay here, but the thought of leaving was just as terrifying. Whatever was out there, it was waiting for me. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes darting to every shadow that moved. The whispers returned, softer now, almost like a distant echo, but they were there, lurking in the corners of my mind. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the TV, but it was no use. The images on the screen seemed to twist and distort, the faces of the actors melting into grotesque masks of horror. I turned it off, but the silence was worse. The house seemed to breathe around me, the walls creaking and groaning like the bones of some ancient beast. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the windows, I felt a small measure of relief. The shadows receded, and the whispers grew quieter, but the unease in my chest remained. I knew I couldn't stay here, not another night. I needed to get out, to find help, but the thought of leaving the house filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. It was like the house itself didn't want me to leave, like it was alive and feeding off my fear. But I couldn't stay here, not with the whispers growing louder every day, not with the shadows moving on their own. I packed a bag with the essentials, clothes, food, a flashlight, and headed for the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't open. But it did, and I stepped out into the cool morning air. The woods surrounding the house were dense and dark, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I hesitated on the porch, my eyes scanning the tree-line for any sign of movement. The whispers were still there, faint but unmistakable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a deep breath and started down the path that led to the road. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. The further I got from the house, the louder the whispers became, until they were almost deafening. I wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of the house, but I forced myself to keep going. The road was only a mile away, and once I reached it, I could flag down a car and get out of here. But as I walked, the woods seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending like they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just in my head anymore, they were coming from the trees. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest, the bag bouncing against my back. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step, until they were a deafening roar. I could see the road up ahead, a sliver of light through the trees, and I pushed myself to run faster. But just as I reached the edge of the woods, something grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me, and when I looked back, I saw it, a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the ground. I kicked at it, my heart racing, and scrambled to my feet. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled out of the woods and onto the road, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. I looked back at the house, my chest heaving, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the window, a face, pale and twisted, watching me with eyes that glowed like embers. I turned and ran down the road, the whispers fading with every step, but the image of that face stayed with me, burned into my mind like a brand. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station at the edge of town, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the pavement. The attendant came out, his face a mask of concern, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare back at the woods, the whispers still ringing in my ears. I spent the next few days in a motel, trying to convince myself it was over. The whispers were gone, and the house was miles away, but the fear stayed with me, a constant weight on my chest. I told myself I was safe, that whatever had been in the house couldn't follow me here, but deep down, I knew better. The face in the window, the whispers in the woods, they were real, and they weren't going to let me go. I tried to call for help, to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said it was just stress, that I needed to rest, but I knew the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted me back. It's been a week since I left, but the whispers have started again. They're faint, almost like a distant echo, but they're there, lurking in the corners of my mind. I see the face in the window every time I close my eyes, and I know it's only a matter of time before the shadows come for me. I don't know what to do, where to go. The house is calling me, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. The whispers are growing louder, more insistent, and I know they won't stop until I go back. But I can't. I can't go back. Not to that house. Not to the darkness. But the whispers, they're inside me now. And I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The rain had been falling for hours, thick and relentless, turning the dirt road into a muddy trap that sucked at the tires of my car. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, but even then, visibility was nearly zero. The headlights barely cut through the mist that hung low over the road, thick as smoke. I had been driving for what felt like an eternity, my phone's battery dead, my GPS useless. I was completely alone, lost in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but towering trees that seemed to close in the further I drove. Then, the worst happened. A sudden jolt. The car sputtered and coughed before the engine gave out entirely. I gripped the steering wheel, cursing under my breath. The gas gauge had lied to me. I was stranded. I sat there for a few minutes, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, my breath fogging up the windshield. There was no way I could just sit here and wait. No one was coming. No one even knew where I was. I had taken a back road, one I thought would be a shortcut. I had passed no other cars for the last hour. The forest was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. I knew I had no choice. I had to find shelter, at least until the rain let up. Steeling myself, I grabbed my jacket, pulled it tight around me, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me instantly, the wind slicing through my clothes like knives. I shivered as I trudged through the mud, my shoes sinking with every step. I followed the road for a while, but it soon became clear I wasn't going to find any help that way. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Then, in the distance, I spotted it. A faint light flickering through the trees. A house. A cabin. Whatever it was my best chance. I turned off the road and made my way toward it. The forest was alive with sound. The rain tapping against the leaves, the distant howl of wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere unseen. I kept my eyes on the light ahead, pushing through the underbrush, my clothes soaked through by now. As I got closer, I could make out the structure, a house, old and weathered, standing alone in the woods. It had an air of abandonment, the windows dark except for one, where the light shone dimly. The porch sagged, the wooden steps slick with rain. I hesitated, my gut twisting with something I couldn't name. But what choice did I have? I knocked on the door, the sound barely audible over the storm. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. A man stood there, his face cast in shadow. He was tall, his posture stiff, his breath slow and even. His eyes, though, were the most unsettling thing, too wide, too dark. He stared at me for a moment before stepping aside, wordlessly inviting me in. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But the cold, the rain, the exhaustion, they all pushed me forward. I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern on a wooden table. The walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper, peeling in places. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I took a step forward. The man shut the door behind me with a slow, deliberate movement. I turned to thank him, but the words died in my throat when I saw his expression. He was still staring, unmoving, unblinking. "You're lost," he finally said, his voice low and hollow. I swallowed. "Yeah. My car broke down. I was hoping I could wait here until the rain lets up." He nodded once, but his expression didn't change. He turned away and walked deeper into the house, leaving me standing there. I debated leaving, stepping back out into the storm, but something held me in place. Maybe it was the way the house felt, ancient, forgotten, as if time had stopped inside it. Maybe it was the way the rain battered the windows, making the outside world feel even more hostile. Or maybe it was the lingering feeling that I was already in too deep. I followed him into what seemed like a living room. The furniture was old, covered in a thin layer of dust. A single chair sat near the fireplace, where embers glowed faintly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. There were no pictures, no personal belongings, just an empty house with an empty man standing in it. "Sit," he said, motioning toward the chair. I hesitated but obeyed. The wood groaned under my weight. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, I cleared my throat. "Do you live here alone?" I asked. His gaze shifted slightly, but he didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, "Not always." A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the way he said it, the way his voice dropped just slightly at the end, made my skin crawl. I wanted to ask more, but something told me not to. Instead, I glanced around the room again. My eyes landed on a door near the back of the house. It was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal darkness beyond. A chill crept along my neck. "Is there a phone I could use?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was even lower. "No phone." Something about the way he said it, the finality of it, made my stomach twist. The storm outside raged on, wind howling against the house, but inside, the air was heavy, thick with something unseen. I could feel it pressing against me, wrapping around me like unseen hands. I needed to leave. Now. I stood abruptly. "You know what? I think I'll just head back to my car. Maybe a tow truck will pass by." He didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at me with those dark, empty eyes. Then, slowly, his lips curled into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. "You won't make it," he said. My breath caught in my throat. "What?" "The forest," he whispered. "It doesn't let people leave." A crack of thunder shook the house. The lantern flickered. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, reaching toward me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I turned toward the door, ready to bolt, but something shifted in the corner of my eye. The darkened doorway at the back of the house. It wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood there. Still. Silent. Its face obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. The man in front of me didn't move, didn't react. As if he didn't even see it. I took a step back. The figure took a step forward. And then, the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed the room in an instant, thick and absolute. My breath hitched in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears like a war drum. The rain outside turned into white noise, the creaks of the old house becoming sharper, more pronounced. I could hear my own breathing, shallow, unsteady. And then, something else. A breath. But it wasn't mine. I tried to move, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The air around me thickened, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure from the doorway had stepped forward, though I couldn't see it, I could feel it, its presence looming in the suffocating dark. My skin prickled with cold fear as the silence stretched, wrapping around me like unseen hands tightening around my throat. I forced myself to take a step back, but the floorboards betrayed me with a groan that echoed through the house. The breath in the dark hitched, as if acknowledging my movement. Then, the sound of a footstep. Slow. Deliberate. The air shifted, and a hand, ice-cold and dry, brushed against my arm. I recoiled, a strangled gasp escaping my lips as I stumbled backward. My shoulder struck the edge of the table, knocking over the lantern with a dull thud. Panic clawed at my chest. I turned toward where I knew the front door was, but something stopped me. A whisper. A voice so low, so distant, it almost wasn't there. You can't leave. My blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't the man's. It was something else. Something wrong. I turned wildly, desperate to see in the inky blackness. The storm outside sent lightning flickering through the windows, casting harsh, jagged shadows that danced against the walls. For the briefest second, I saw them. Not just one figure, but many. Dark silhouettes standing in the corners of the room, motionless. Watching. My breath caught, my stomach twisted. The flash ended, plunging me back into the dark. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. My limbs felt sluggish, as if I were moving through water. Then, a flicker of light. A match. The old man had lit a candle, his face illuminated in the weak glow. He was staring past me, eyes locked onto the figures in the dark. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet acceptance, as if this was expected. As if he had lived this moment before. You should have stayed in your car, he murmured. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. My mouth was dry, my tongue felt thick. What? Who? The words tangled in my throat. I couldn't even form the question. They don't like visitors. I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. My instincts screamed at me to bolt for the door, but the old man's expression held me in place. He wasn't afraid. He was resigned. What are they? I finally managed to choke out. He sighed, glancing toward the shadows where the figures had been. They were here before me. They'll be here after you. Lightning flashed again, and this time, I saw them more clearly. Pale faces, hollow eyes. Some looked human, others didn't. They were blurred at the edges, like unfinished sketches. And they were getting closer. I lurched toward the door, my fingers fumbling for the knob. It didn't budge. My breath came in frantic gasps as I yanked at it again, harder. Behind me, the whispering started. Low at first, like wind through the trees, then rising, overlapping voices speaking in words I couldn't understand. My head throbbed, my vision blurred. The old man didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched as the shadows reached for me. I turned to him, desperate, pleading. "Help me." His gaze met mine, and in that moment, I saw something that terrified me more than anything else. Pity. He shook his head slowly. "It's too late." The room twisted, the walls warping, stretching. The whispering grew deafening, 1,000 voices pouring into my ears at once. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees. Shadows swarmed, cold fingers brushing against my skin. The candle flickered, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I reached for it, grasping for the light, but the moment my fingers grazed the wax, the flame went out. Everything collapsed. I don't remember hitting the floor. I don't remember the moment the darkness swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the house. I was in the forest. The rain had stopped, the air thick with mist. My body ached, my head pounded. I pushed myself up, disoriented. My car was nowhere in sight. The road was gone. The trees around me stretched endlessly in every direction. I turned in circles, my breath coming in short gasps. "Hello." My voice barely carried through the dense fog. I listened, waiting for a response, for anything. But there was only silence. And then, the whispering started again. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The mist shifted, and I saw them. The figures from the house. Standing between the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, didn't speak. They simply watched. I took a step back. They took a step forward. Panic seized my chest. I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me, branches clawing at my skin as I tore through the underbrush. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The whispering followed, growing louder, closer. Then, up ahead, something loomed in the mist. A shape. A structure. My heart leaped. A house. Not just any house. The same house. The sagging porch, the broken shutters. The lantern still sitting on the table inside. I had never left. A choked sob escaped me as I stumbled onto the porch. The front door swung open before I could reach for it. And standing there, waiting, was the old man. His expression didn't change. "I told you," he said quietly. "The forest doesn't let people leave." The whispering swelled, surrounding me, pressing against my skull like a vice. The shadows shifted behind him, stretching, reaching. The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was the reflection in the window. It wasn't mine. The moment the door slammed shut, the whispering stopped. Silence fell so abruptly that it made my ears ring. My chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths as I turned back to the old man, my fingers trembling at my sides. His eyes, dark and hollow, studied me with the same quiet resignation, like he had watched this play out 1,000 times before. "I don't understand," I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What is this place?" The old man let out a long, tired sigh, stepping past me toward the window. He didn't answer immediately, just stared out at the mist-laden forest beyond. The candle on the table flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. "You're part of it now," he said finally. His voice was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. "Just like the rest of us." My skin prickled. "The rest of us?" I echoed. I turned slowly, my gaze darting to the darkened corners of the room. The air felt thick, oppressive, and I suddenly became aware of how I hadn't seen him light the candle. It had just appeared. Burning. Flickering. Like it had always been there. He nodded. "They were all travelers. Just like you. Thought they could pass through. Thought they could leave." His gaze turned to me then, and something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. "No one leaves." I swallowed hard. "That's not true." My voice shook. "There has to be a way. There has to be." The floor creaked behind me. A chill shot down my spine as I whipped around. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, stretching, moving just beyond the edge of the candle's light. My breath hitched. There was something in the room with us. Something I couldn't see. "I don't belong here," I whispered, my own voice barely audible. The old man's expression darkened. "None of us do." Then, the candle flickered violently, the flame bending unnaturally, as if something unseen had just exhaled over it. The whispering started again, curling around the edges of my mind like smoke. My pulse thundered in my ears. The shadows moved. They weren't just shifting now. They were coming closer. Panic gripped me as I stumbled back toward the door, my fingers clawing at the handle. It wouldn't turn. It wouldn't move. The old man didn't try to stop me. He just watched. "The more you fight it," he said softly, "the tighter its grip." I ignored him. I had to get out. There had to be a way. My heart pounded as I threw my weight against the door. "Let me go!" I screamed. The room groaned around me. The walls stretched, warped. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, like I was standing on something alive. The whispering grew louder. Closer. It was in my head now, slithering through my thoughts like a parasite. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. I gasped for breath, my vision swimming. My hand still clutched the doorknob, my knuckles white. The candlelight flickered weakly behind me. And then the old man spoke. "Go ahead," he murmured. "Open it." My heart stopped. Because this time, the knob turned. Story 2. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was resisting my presence. My breath came in short, visible puffs, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a deafening drum in the stillness. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the darkness behind me. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of trees and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the canopy. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that refused to go away. I quickened my pace, my boots slipping on the icy ground as I tried to put as much distance between myself and whatever lurked in the shadows. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees indistinguishable from one another, their gnarled trunks twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at me as I passed. My mind began to play tricks on me, the shadows morphing into figures that reached out with skeletal hands, only to dissolve into nothingness when I turned to look. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of exhaustion and fear, but the unease in my chest only grew. The path ahead was no longer clear, the ground covered in a thick layer of dead leaves that muffled my footsteps. I could no longer hear the wind, the silence so complete that it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a dying ember. Relief flooded through me, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of my fear. It was just a cabin, probably some hunter's retreat or a forgotten homestead. I could ask for directions, maybe even rest for a while before continuing on my way. The thought of warmth and shelter spurred me forward, and I broke into a jog, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. But as I drew closer, the light seemed to grow dimmer, the cabin itself shrouded in an unnatural darkness that made my skin crawl. The windows were black voids, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted handle. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing dread that whispered for me to turn back. But the cold was too much to bear, and the thought of spending another moment in the forest was unbearable. I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that curled like dead skin. The light I had seen came from a single candle on a rickety table, its flame dancing erratically as if trying to escape its wick. The room was sparsely furnished, a broken chair lying on its side and a moth-eaten rug covering the floor. But it was the staircase that caught my attention, its wooden steps warped and splintered, leading up into impenetrable darkness. I told myself I wouldn't go up there, that I would just wait by the door until the storm passed. But the silence was too much, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I took a step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The sound seemed to echo through the cabin, a low, mournful wail that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached for the candle, my fingers trembling as I lifted it from the table. The flame flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing at the foot of the staircase. The darkness above seemed to pulse, a living, breathing entity that beckoned me forward. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and leave, but my body moved on its own, my feet carrying me up the stairs one creaking step at a time. The second floor was even worse than the first. The air was colder, the smell of decay stronger, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I moved down the narrow hallway. The candlelight barely reached the end of the corridor, the shadows swallowing it whole as if they were alive. I could hear something now, a faint whispering that seemed to come from all around me. The words were unintelligible, a jumble of sounds that made my head ache, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a plea for me to leave while I still could. But I couldn't. My legs carried me forward, my hand reaching out to push open the door at the end of the hall. The room was empty, save for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. Its surface was cracked and clouded, the frame tarnished with age. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and fragmented in the broken glass. But it wasn't my reflection that caught my eye. It was the figure standing behind me, its face obscured by the shadows but its presence undeniable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared into the mirror. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn around, to face whatever was behind me, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, my limbs locked in place as the figure began to move closer. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though I couldn't understand them. The candle in my hand flickered, the flame shrinking until it was little more than a spark. The figure was almost upon me now, its presence suffocating, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that seeped into my very bones. I closed my eyes, my mind screaming for me to wake up, to escape this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone, and the room was empty. The candle had gone out, plunging me into darkness so complete that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled for the door. My fingers found the handle, and I yanked it open, the wood splintering as I threw myself into the hallway. The whispering had stopped, the silence now deafening as I ran down the stairs, my feet slipping on the warped steps. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I turned back to look at the cabin, but it was gone, the space where it had stood now empty. The forest stretched out before me, the trees swaying gently in the wind as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And as I turned to leave, the whispering started again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind like a promise. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. And I knew it would find me again. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the trees closing in like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at me as I ran. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning my lungs as I pushed myself forward, my legs aching with the effort. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. The whispering had followed me out of the cabin, a faint, insidious sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was in the rustle of the leaves, the creak of the branches, the faint sigh of the wind. It was in my head, a constant, maddening hum that made it impossible to think, to focus on anything but the need to escape. I didn't know where I was going. The path I had taken earlier was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the oppressive silence of the forest. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, the faint light it provided barely enough to see a few feet ahead. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum that echoed in my ears. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the cold of the cabin, of the figure in the mirror, and it clung to me like a second skin, a reminder of what I had seen, of what I had felt. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though I still couldn't understand them. They were in a language I didn't recognize, a guttural, alien tongue that made my skin crawl. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It was inside me, a part of me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to the ground, the impact jarring my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my hands scraping against the rough bark of a tree as I pushed myself up. The whispering was almost deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around me, from within me. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was almost as unbearable as the whispering, a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for something, anything, to happen. The forest was still, the trees unmoving, the air thick with a tension that made my skin prickle. I could feel it again, that sensation of being watched, of not being alone. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of trees and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the canopy. But I knew it was there. I could feel it, a presence that was both familiar and alien, something that didn't belong in this world. It was the figure from the mirror, the thing that had been standing behind me, watching me. It was here, in the forest, and it was waiting. I took a step back, my foot crunching on a dead branch, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I waited for a response, for some sign that it had heard me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me forward even as my mind screamed at me to stop, to hide, to do anything but run. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees indistinguishable from one another, their gnarled trunks twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at me as I passed. My mind began to play tricks on me, the shadows morphing into figures that reached out with skeletal hands, only to dissolve into nothingness when I turned to look. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of exhaustion and fear, but the unease in my chest only grew. And then I saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a dying ember. Relief flooded through me, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of my fear. It was just a cabin, probably some hunter's retreat or a forgotten homestead. I could ask for directions, maybe even rest for a while before continuing on my way. The thought of warmth and shelter spurred me forward, and I broke into a jog, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. But as I drew closer, the light seemed to grow dimmer, the cabin itself shrouded in an unnatural darkness that made my skin crawl. The windows were black voids, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted handle. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing dread that whispered for me to turn back. But the cold was too much to bear, and the thought of spending another moment in the forest was unbearable. I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that curled like dead skin. The light I had seen came from a single candle on a rickety table, its flame dancing erratically as if trying to escape its wick. The room was sparsely furnished, a broken chair lying on its side and a moth-eaten rug covering the floor. But it was the staircase that caught my attention, its wooden steps warped and splintered, leading up into impenetrable darkness. I told myself I wouldn't go up there, that I would just wait by the door until the storm passed. But the silence was too much, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I took a step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The sound seemed to echo through the cabin, a low, mournful wail that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached for the candle, my fingers trembling as I lifted it from the table. The flame flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing at the foot of the staircase. The darkness above seemed to pulse, a living, breathing entity that beckoned me forward. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and leave, but my body moved on its own, my feet carrying me up the stairs one creaking step at a time. The second floor was even worse than the first. The air was colder, the smell of decay stronger, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I moved down the narrow hallway. The candlelight barely reached the end of the corridor, the shadows swallowing it whole as if they were alive. I could hear something now, a faint whispering that seemed to come from all around me. The words were unintelligible, a jumble of sounds that made my head ache, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a plea for me to leave while I still could. But I couldn't. My legs carried me forward, my hand reaching out to push open the door at the end of the hall. The room was empty, save for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. Its surface was cracked and clouded, the frame tarnished with age. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and fragmented in the broken glass. But it wasn't my reflection that caught my eye. It was the figure standing behind me, its face obscured by the shadows but its presence undeniable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared into the mirror. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn around, to face whatever was behind me, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, my limbs locked in place as the figure began to move closer. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though I couldn't understand them. The candle in my hand flickered, the flame shrinking until it was little more than a spark. The figure was almost upon me now, its presence suffocating, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that seeped into my very bones. I closed my eyes, my mind screaming for me to wake up, to escape this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone, and the room was empty. The candle had gone out, plunging me into darkness so complete that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled for the door. My fingers found the handle, and I yanked it open, the wood splintering as I threw myself into the hallway. The whispering had stopped, the silence now deafening as I ran down the stairs, my feet slipping on the warped steps. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I turned back to look at the cabin, but it was gone, the space where it had stood now empty. The forest stretched out before me, the trees swaying gently in the wind as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And as I turned to leave, the whispering started again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind like a promise. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. And I knew it would find me again. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the trees closing in like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at me as I ran. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one burning my lungs as I pushed myself forward, my legs aching with the effort. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. The whispering had followed me out of the cabin, a faint, insidious sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was in the rustle of the leaves, the creak of the branches, the faint sigh of the wind. It was in my head, a constant, maddening hum that made it impossible to think, to focus on anything but the need to escape. I didn't know where I was going. The path I had taken earlier was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the oppressive silence of the forest. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, the faint light it provided barely enough to see a few feet ahead. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum that echoed in my ears. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the cold of the cabin, of the figure in the mirror, and it clung to me like a second skin, a reminder of what I had seen, of what I had felt. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though I still couldn't understand them. They were in a language I didn't recognize, a guttural, alien tongue that made my skin crawl. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It was inside me, a part of me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to the ground, the impact jarring my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my hands scraping against the rough bark of a tree as I pushed myself up. The whispering was almost deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around me, from within me. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was almost as unbearable as the whispering, a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for something, anything, to happen. The forest was still, the trees unmoving, the air thick with a tension that made my skin prickle. I could feel it again, that sensation of being watched, of not being alone. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of trees and the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the canopy. But I knew it was there. I could feel it, a presence that was both familiar and alien, something that didn't belong in this world. It was the figure from the mirror, the thing that had been standing behind me, watching me. It was here, in the forest, and it was waiting. I took a step back, my foot crunching on a dead branch, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I waited for a response, for some sign that it had heard me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me forward even as my mind screamed at me to stop, to hide, to do anything but run. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees indistinguishable from one another, their gnarled trunks twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at me as I passed. My mind began to play tricks on me, the shadows morphing into figures that reached out with skeletal hands, only to dissolve into nothingness when I turned to look. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of exhaustion and fear, but the unease in my chest only grew. And then I saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a dying ember. Relief flooded through me, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of my fear. It was just a cabin, probably some hunter's retreat or a forgotten homestead. I could ask for directions, maybe even rest for a while before continuing on my way. The thought of warmth and shelter spurred me forward, and I broke into a jog, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. But as I drew closer, the light seemed to grow dimmer, the cabin itself shrouded in an unnatural darkness that made my skin crawl. The windows were black voids, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted handle. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing dread that whispered for me to turn back. But the cold was too much to bear, and the thought of spending another moment in the forest was unbearable. I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that curled like dead skin. The light I had seen came from a single candle on a rickety table, its flame dancing erratically as if trying to escape its wick. The room was sparsely furnished, a broken chair lying on its side and a moth-eaten rug covering the floor. But it was the staircase that caught my attention, its wooden steps warped and splintered, leading up into impenetrable darkness. I told myself I wouldn't go up there, that I would just wait by the door until the storm passed. But the silence was too much, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I took a step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The sound seemed to echo through the cabin, a low, mournful wail that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached for the candle, my fingers trembling as I lifted it from the table. The flame flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing at the foot of the staircase. The darkness above seemed to pulse, a living, breathing entity that beckoned me forward. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and leave, but my body moved on its own, my feet carrying me up the stairs one creaking step at a time. The second floor was even worse than the first. The air was colder, the smell of decay stronger, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I moved down the narrow hallway. The candlelight barely reached the end of the corridor, the shadows swallowing it whole as if they were alive. I could hear something now, a faint whispering that seemed to come from all around me. The words were unintelligible, a jumble of sounds that made my head ache, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a plea for me to leave while I still could. But I couldn't. My legs carried me forward, my hand reaching out to push open the door at the end of the hall. The room was empty, save for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. Its surface was cracked and clouded, the frame tarnished with age. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and fragmented in the broken glass. But it wasn't my reflection that caught my eye. It was the figure standing behind me, its face obscured by the shadows but its presence undeniable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared into the mirror. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn around, to face whatever was behind me, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, my limbs locked in place as the figure began to move closer. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though I couldn't understand them. The candle in my hand flickered, the flame shrinking until it was little more than a spark. The figure was almost upon me now, its presence suffocating, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that seeped into my very bones. I closed my eyes, my mind screaming for me to wake up, to escape this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone, and the room was empty. The candle had gone out, plunging me into darkness so complete that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled for the door. My fingers found the handle, and I yanked it open, the wood splintering as I threw myself into the hallway. The whispering had stopped, the silence now deafening as I ran down the stairs, my feet slipping on the warped steps. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I turned back to look at the cabin, but it was gone, the space where it had stood now empty. The forest stretched out before me. The road stretched endlessly before me, a dark ribbon cutting through the vast emptiness of the countryside. The headlights of my car barely penetrated the thick fog that rolled across the asphalt in slow, ghostly tendrils. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white with tension. It had been a long drive, and exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but stopping wasn't an option. Not here. Not in the middle of nowhere. The old map crumpled on the passenger seat had long since ceased to be useful. I had taken a wrong turn hours ago, and the GPS on my phone refused to connect to anything but static. The further I drove, the more distant civilization seemed. The houses had thinned out, the streetlights disappearing one by one until there was only the suffocating blackness of the night pressing in on all sides. Then I saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. A faint, golden glow, like the beam of a lantern cutting through the fog. My heart leaped at the sight of it. Finally, a sign of life. A place to stop, to ask for directions, maybe even rest for a few hours before continuing my journey. As I drew closer, the light revealed itself to be coming from an old roadside motel, its neon sign flickering weakly against the darkness. I pulled into the cracked parking lot, the tires crunching over gravel. The building was small, 2 stories, its paint peeling and windows smeared with grime. It had the kind of atmosphere that screamed neglect, but at this point, I didn't care. I just needed a place to stay. I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff limbs, and made my way to the front desk. The lobby was dimly lit, the air stale with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. A single desk stood in the center, an old-fashioned bell resting on top. I pressed it once, the sharp ring cutting through the silence. A man emerged from the shadows behind the counter. He was tall, gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His eyes were deep-set, almost too dark, as if they had swallowed the light. He smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need a room?" His voice was low, gravelly, almost hesitant. I nodded, my voice coming out hoarse. "Yeah. Just for the night." He slid a dusty guest book toward me, along with an old pen that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I scrawled my name, Ethan Carter, onto the yellowed pages, my signature barely legible through my exhaustion. "Room 7, the man said, handing me a key. His fingers brushed against mine, ice cold. I suppressed a shiver and took the key, forcing a polite smile before heading toward the hallway. The corridor was narrow, lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. The dim light bulbs flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows against the floor. My footsteps echoed eerily as I made my way to my room. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a modest space, a bed, a nightstand, a single lamp casting a weak glow. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag onto the floor, shut the door behind me, and collapsed onto the bed, letting out a deep sigh. Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but something felt off. It was a prickling sensation, like being watched. The air felt denser, pressing against my skin. I turned onto my side, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Then I heard it. A faint scratching noise. Slow. Deliberate. It was coming from the wall behind me. I held my breath, my body frozen. Maybe it was just a rat, I told myself. Or the old pipes shifting. But the sound persisted, scritch, 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 like fingernails dragging across wood. My pulse hammered in my ears as I sat up, scanning the room. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. Soft knocking. Not at the door. From inside the wall. I shot out of bed, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I pressed my ear against the surface, listening. Silence. I shook my head, running a hand through my hair. I was just tired. That was all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I turned off the lamp, forcing myself back into bed. Sleep came in fragments, torn apart by restless dreams. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispering started sometime after midnight. A low, murmuring sound, impossible to make out. It wove through my dreams, pulling me toward wakefulness. I opened my eyes, the room still shrouded in darkness. The whispering hadn't stopped. It was inside the room. My body stiffened, every muscle locked in place. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen but undeniably there. I reached for the lamp, my fingers trembling as I flicked the switch. Nothing happened. The bulb remained dark. The whispering grew louder. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone, its weak glow illuminating the room. The air turned ice cold. My breath came out in white puffs. Then the closet door creaked open. A sliver of darkness yawned in the corner of the room. The whispering stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. A shape shifted in the blackness of the closet, just beyond the reach of my phone's light. My grip tightened on the device, my pulse hammering in my throat. A single, pale hand emerged from the darkness, its fingers curling against the doorframe. Long, unnaturally thin. The nails blackened. The skin stretched too tight over the knuckles. I scrambled backward, my body slamming against the headboard. The figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Its movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with severed strings. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my limbs refused to obey. The thing in the closet tilted its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. Then it spoke. A voice like dry leaves crumbling underfoot. A voice that wasn't human. You shouldn't have come here. A wave of nausea rolled through me. The room spun. The darkness deepened. My vision blurred, the world tilting sideways as my body gave in to unconsciousness. I don't remember hitting the floor. When I woke up, the room was empty. The closet door stood wide open, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. The motel was silent. Too silent. I reached for my phone. Dead. A sick feeling twisted in my gut as I stood, my legs shaky beneath me. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my bag and bolted from the room, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The hallway stretched before me, endless, the lights flickering overhead. I reached the lobby. The front desk was empty. The guest book was gone. The man who had given me the key, gone. As if none of it had ever existed. The air outside was thick with fog, swallowing the road, the parking lot, everything beyond a few feet in front of me. My car sat where I had left it, coated in a fine layer of dust. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me as I slammed the car into reverse, peeling out of the lot. The motel faded into the fog behind me. I didn't look back. But as I drove away, I swear I saw it in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe. But I know one thing. That place wasn't abandoned. And I was never supposed to leave. The road stretched ahead, endless and suffocating in the dense fog. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, knuckles white as I gripped it tighter. My heartbeat refused to slow, hammering against my ribs like a desperate warning. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that figure again, standing in the middle of the road, watching, waiting. But there was nothing. Just the fog, thick and heavy, swirling like restless ghosts in the dim glow of my taillights. I needed to get as far away from that motel as possible. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had exhaustion twisted reality into something monstrous? No. The feeling still clung to me, like cold fingers trailing down my spine. I hadn't imagined that voice, that figure, the unnatural way it moved. Something had been there. Something had been watching me, whispering to me. I reached for my phone again, hoping the battery had somehow come back to life, but the screen remained black. Dead. Useless. The thought of stopping to charge it, to even pull over, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was certain that I was miles away from whatever that place was. The road felt wrong. I had been driving straight for what felt like hours, yet nothing changed. No road signs. No turns. No landmarks. Just endless asphalt stretching into the mist. My stomach churned with unease. I couldn't have made a mistake. I had been following the road back toward the highway. Hadn't I? My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. I just needed to keep going, needed to find my way out of this. Then the gaslight flickered on. My pulse spiked. That wasn't possible. I had filled up before getting lost. There was no way I had burned through a full tank so quickly. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic. Maybe I had miscalculated. Maybe I had been driving longer than I realized. But the road, it still hadn't changed. A shape loomed in the distance. My stomach dropped. The motel. My hands clenched the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. No. No, that wasn't possible. I had driven away. I had left it behind. Yet there it was, sitting in the fog like a waiting predator. The flickering neon sign cast a weak glow against the night, exactly where I had left it. I hit the brakes, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to find another way, but something deep inside whispered that it wouldn't matter. The road wasn't taking me away. It was leading me back. I couldn't stay in the car. I needed to figure out what was happening. My legs felt like lead as I stepped out, the cool night air biting into my skin. The fog clung to me, thick and damp, muffling sound. I approached the motel, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the cracked pavement. The lobby door creaked as I pushed it open. The front desk was empty. The air smelled of dust and something stale, something rotten just beneath the surface. The guest book was gone, the old belt sitting silently on the counter. There was no sign of the man who had given me the key, no trace of my presence from earlier. It was as if I had never been there. I turned back toward the hallway. The same flickering lights, the same curling wallpaper. My breath hitched when I saw the doors. They were all open. Every single room, their doors yawning wide, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The air shifted, heavy with something unseen. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get back in the car, to try again, but my feet moved forward, as if pulled by something stronger than fear. Room 7. My room. The door stood slightly ajar, the dim light from the hallway barely penetrating the blackness inside. My breath came out shaky as I stepped closer, heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I reached out, pushing the door open fully. The bed was exactly as I had left it. Sheets rumpled. My bag still on the floor. But something was different. The air was wrong. And then I saw it. A single handprint, smeared in something dark, staining the wall above the bed. It was too large, the fingers too long, the proportions all wrong. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering started again. Soft. Just beyond the edges of hearing. Rising and falling in a language I didn't understand, curling around me like invisible tendrils. The closet door creaked. My body refused to move. The whispering grew louder, the air growing colder by the second. Shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally along the walls, distorting the room. My vision swam as dizziness crashed over me. Something stepped out of the closet. I saw the shape first. Tall. Inhumanly thin. Limbs that bent in unnatural angles. Its head tilted as it watched me, hollow eyes filled with something ancient, something hungry. My voice caught in my throat as I stumbled back. The thing took a step forward. A sound filled the air, a low, wet whisper. The same words I had heard before. You shouldn't have come back. A force hit me, sudden and overwhelming, as if the very air had turned solid. My vision blurred, darkness creeping at the edges. My body felt heavy, sinking into an abyss I couldn't escape. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its face. It wasn't human. It never had been. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting the room in golden hues. My heart still pounded, my mind scrambling to process what had just happened. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? But the handprint was still on the wall. And when I reached for my phone, the battery was fully charged. I checked the time. Only 5 minutes had passed since I had first walked into this room. I wasn't dreaming. I was still here. And I didn't think I could leave. Story 2. The first time I saw the figure in the corner of my room, I told myself it was just a trick of the light. It was late, the kind of late where the world feels like it's holding its breath, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep, when I felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, like the air had suddenly thickened around me. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, and there it was. A shadow, darker than the rest, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into me, like it was waiting for me to do something. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I opened them again, the corner was empty. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after too many late nights and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The house had always felt off, ever since I moved in. It was too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The realtor had called it charming, a cozy little cottage with character. What she didn't mention was the way the air always felt heavier in certain rooms, or how the temperature would drop suddenly, like you'd stepped into an invisible pocket of winter. I'd laughed it off at first, chalking it up to the quirks of an old house. But now, lying in bed with the memory of that figure still fresh in my mind, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I made coffee, the familiar routine grounding me as the sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. But even in the daylight, the house felt different. The shadows were sharper, the silence more pronounced. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure lurking in the corners. By midday, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and left, telling myself I just needed some fresh air. But as I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Every passing car, every pedestrian, felt like a potential threat. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the memory of that figure lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. When I returned home that evening, the house was waiting for me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. I hesitated on the threshold, my hand gripping the doorknob like it was a lifeline. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than usual. I forced myself to step inside, my footsteps loud in the silence. The feeling of being watched returned as soon as I closed the door, stronger this time, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the mundane tasks of unpacking groceries and tidying up, but the unease in my chest grew with every passing minute. And then, just as I was about to sit down, I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the hallway, just out of sight. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the house settling or the pipes groaning, but deep down, I knew better. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, like whatever was making it knew I was listening. I forced myself to move, to step into the hallway and face whatever was there. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen behind me. The sound stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway, and for a moment, there was silence. And then, from the darkness, I saw it, a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the shadows. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and the hand disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and returned to the hallway, my hands trembling as I shone the light into the shadows. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, the beam of the flashlight shaking as I scanned the walls. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a door, hidden in the shadows, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the light. I reached out to touch it, and the air grew colder, the whispers returning, faint but unmistakable. The door was locked, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the whispers have grown louder, more insistent. They follow me everywhere, a constant reminder that I'm not alone. I've tried to leave the house, but every time I get to the door, something stops me. It's like an invisible force, pushing me back inside. I've stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The shadows in the house are darker now, more alive. I see things moving in the corners of my vision, shapes that disappear when I turn to look. And the whispers, they're not just whispers anymore. They're voices, real voices, speaking in a language I don't understand but somehow know is meant for me. Last night, I found the door again. It was in my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed like it had always been there. The whispers were deafening, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction. I knew what was on the other side, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached out to touch it, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I wanted to look away, to close the door and pretend I'd never seen it. But I couldn't. The sound was too familiar, too real. And then, just as I was about to scream, the door opened. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness on the other side of the door. When I finally found the courage to step through, the room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The whispers returned, louder and more desperate, and I realized they weren't just in my head anymore, they were coming from the walls. I turned to leave, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall covered in the same strange symbols. I was trapped, the whispers growing louder with every passing second, until they were a deafening roar. And then, just as I was about to scream, the lights went out. I woke up this morning in my bed, the door gone, but the whispers are still there, faint but unmistakable. The house feels different now, like it's alive, watching me, waiting. I don't know what's coming next, but I know it's going to be worse. And as I sit here, writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Something is here with me, something that's been here all along. And it's not going to let me go. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me everywhere, a constant hum in the back of my mind, like static from a broken radio. At first, I tried to drown them out, music, TV, the sound of my own voice talking to myself, but nothing worked. They were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for me to let my guard down. And when I did, they grew louder, more insistent, until I could almost make out the words. Almost, but not quite. It was maddening. The house felt different now, too. It wasn't just the cold spots or the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing, watching me. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if they had a heartbeat, and the air was thick with the scent of something old and rotten, like decay. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stress get to me, but deep down, I knew better. Something was in the house with me, something ancient and malevolent, and it wasn't going to let me go. I spent the next few days trying to find answers. I scoured the internet for information about the house, but there was nothing, no records, no history, nothing. It was like the house didn't exist before I moved in. I even tried to contact the realtor, but her number was disconnected, and her office was empty, as if it had never been there at all. The more I searched, the more I realized how little I knew about the house, about the town, about everything. It was like I had stepped into a void, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. And then, one night, I found it, a hidden compartment in the floorboards of the attic. I had been up there, searching for anything that might give me a clue, when I noticed a loose board. I pried it up, my hands trembling, and found a small, dusty box underneath. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age, and a journal, its pages brittle and covered in cramped, spidery handwriting. The photographs were of people, men, women, children, but there was something wrong with them. Their faces were twisted in expressions of pure terror, their eyes wide and staring, as if they had seen something unimaginable. And in the background of every photo, barely visible, was the same figure, a shadowy, indistinct shape, always just out of focus. I opened the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. The handwriting was hard to read, the ink faded and smudged, but I could make out enough to understand. The journal belonged to someone who had lived in the house decades ago, someone who had experienced the same things I was experiencing now. The entries were filled with descriptions of the whispers, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. And then, toward the end, the entries changed. The handwriting became more frantic, the words almost illegible, as if the writer had been in a state of panic. The last entry was just a single sentence, scrawled across the page in bold, shaky letters, "It's in the walls." I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those words, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I took the journal and the photographs downstairs, my mind racing. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, and I could almost make out the words. Almost, but not quite. I tried to focus, to push them aside, but it was no use. They were inside me now, a part of me, and I knew they weren't going to stop. That night, I had the dream. I was standing in the hallway, the door with the strange symbols in front of me. The whispers were deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I reached out to touch the door, and it opened, revealing a darkness so complete it felt like I was staring into the void. And then, from the darkness, I saw it, the figure, the same one from the photographs, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It reached out for me, its fingers long and skeletal, and I woke up screaming. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay in the house, not another night. I packed a bag with the essentials, clothes, food, a flashlight, and headed for the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't open. But it did, and I stepped out into the cool morning air. The woods surrounding the house were dense and dark, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I hesitated on the porch, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The whispers were still there, faint but unmistakable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a deep breath and started down the path that led to the road. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. The further I got from the house, the louder the whispers became, until they were almost deafening. I wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of the house, but I forced myself to keep going. The road was only a mile away, and once I reached it, I could flag down a car and get out of here. But as I walked, the woods seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending like they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just in my head anymore, they were coming from the trees. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest, the bag bouncing against my back. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step, until they were a deafening roar. I could see the road up ahead, a sliver of light through the trees, and I pushed myself to run faster. But just as I reached the edge of the woods, something grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me, and when I looked back, I saw it, a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the ground. I kicked at it, my heart racing, and scrambled to my feet. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled out of the woods and onto the road, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. I looked back at the house, my chest heaving, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the window, a face, pale and twisted, watching me with eyes that glowed like embers. I turned and ran down the road, the whispers fading with every step, but the image of that face stayed with me, burned into my mind like a brand. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station at the edge of town, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the pavement. The attendant came out, his face a mask of concern, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare back at the woods, the whispers still ringing in my ears. I spent the next few days in a motel, trying to convince myself it was over. The whispers were gone, and the house was miles away, but the fear stayed with me, a constant weight on my chest. I told myself I was safe, that whatever had been in the house couldn't follow me here, but deep down, I knew better. The face in the window, the whispers in the woods, they were real, and they weren't going to let me go. I tried to call for help, to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said it was just stress, that I needed to rest, but I knew the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted me back. It's been a week since I left, but the whispers have started again. They're faint, almost like a distant echo, but they're there, lurking in the corners of my mind. I see the face in the window every time I close my eyes. I never should have gone back to that house. I told myself for years that it was just my imagination, that what I saw and heard as a child was just a series of bad dreams or the overactive mind of a scared little boy. But now, standing in the middle of this decayed ruin, I realize that some memories don't fade with time. They only grow stronger in the darkness, waiting for you to return. It had been 20 years since I last stepped foot inside. My parents moved away when I was 10, taking me far from the house that tormented me. But after their deaths, the property was left in my name. I debated selling it, never setting foot inside again, but curiosity got the best of me. Maybe I just wanted closure. Maybe I wanted proof that everything I remembered was just childhood paranoia. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, I felt it again, that oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, the thick scent of damp wood and decay clinging to my skin. The house had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the cold embrace of time. The walls were cracked, the floors uneven, and the air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The worst part was the silence. Even though the wind howled outside and the branches of the trees scraped against the windows, the house itself was deathly quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I walked slowly through the familiar halls, each step stirring up memories I had buried deep. The living room where I first saw the shadow in the corner. The hallway where whispers had followed me in the dark. The basement door, still closed, still sealed shut with the heavy lock my father had put on it years ago. A lock that never should have been necessary. I hesitated before reaching out to touch it, my fingers grazing the rusted metal. I never knew why my parents were so terrified of the basement. They never let me go down there, and I never saw them go down either. But at night, I heard things. Scraping sounds. Heavy breathing. The soft, deliberate creak of footsteps moving just below my room. I had convinced myself that it was nothing, that my parents had simply been protecting me from a moldy, unfinished basement. But standing here now, with the old lock cold beneath my fingers, I wasn't so sure. A sudden creak echoed through the house, and I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The front door stood open, just as I had left it. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, but that sound, that wasn't the wind. It came from upstairs. The sound of a footstep. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to never come back, but my feet wouldn't move. My heart pounded violently against my ribs as I forced myself to take a step forward. Then another. The staircase loomed ahead, each step warped with age. The sound came again, just above me. My childhood bedroom. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I climbed the stairs. The air was colder up here, heavy with a strange, damp smell that I didn't remember. I reached the hallway, the door to my old room standing slightly ajar. The dim light from outside cast a long shadow across the floor, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement within. My fingers trembled as I pushed the door open, revealing the darkened space beyond. Everything was as I remembered. The small wooden desk by the window. The faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The closet door, slightly open, revealing the black void inside. But something was wrong. The bed. It was made. The sheet stretched tightly across the mattress, as if someone had been living here. But no one had stepped foot inside this house for decades. I backed away, my skin crawling as the air seemed to shift around me. That was when I heard it. A whisper. Soft. Hushed. Coming from the closet. My breath hitched as I turned toward it. The door stood open just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness within. I knew I shouldn't. I knew I should leave and never look back. But some awful, irresistible pull dragged me forward. My fingers brushed against the edge of the door, and as I slowly pushed it open, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the corner of the closet, was a figure. Crouched. Motionless. Its body twisted at an unnatural angle, its face obscured by the deep shadows. And then, it moved. A sudden jerk, like a puppet on tangled strings, its head snapping toward me. Two eyes, hollow and glistening, locked onto mine. A grin spread across its face, wide and grotesque, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled backward, slamming the closet door shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the whispering turned into a low, guttural chuckle. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, crashing through the door and down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut before I could touch it. A voice, not quite human, not quite real, rasped from behind me. You came back. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The air was thick with a suffocating presence, a coldness that burrowed deep into my bones. My fingers fumbled with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. Every second felt like an eternity, the darkness pressing closer, the whispering now a chorus of voices, overlapping, growing louder, more frantic. Then, the basement door creaked open. I heard it swing on rusted hinges, slow and deliberate, revealing the pitch-black void beyond. A rush of icy air spilled out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Something shifted in the darkness below. Not footsteps. Something worse. Something crawling. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, thick and absolute. And then, a hand. Pale, skeletal, too long, too thin, emerged from the shadows of the basement doorway, fingers curling against the wooden floor. Another hand followed. And then, slowly, something began to pull itself up into the light. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember bursting through the front door, my legs carrying me blindly into the night. I only remember running until my lungs burned, until the house was far behind me, swallowed by the darkness. But I know it's not over. The house is still there, waiting. The whispers have followed me, creeping into my dreams, slipping into the silence of the night. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see it. That thing in the closet. The thing in the basement. And I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me to come back. I tried to forget. I tried to convince myself that what I saw was just my imagination, the result of exhaustion and an overactive mind. But the truth has a way of creeping back in, slipping through the cracks no matter how much you try to seal them. In the days that followed, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, that twisted, unnatural thing, the way it moved, the way its hollow eyes locked onto mine, the way the darkness in that house felt alive, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I stayed away. I told myself I'd never set foot there again. But the whispers followed. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable. A rustling sound just behind me when I turned off the lights. A breath against my ear in the dead of night. Then, they grew louder. More distinct. My name, murmured from the farthest corners of my apartment. The feeling of something watching me, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. I refused to look. I refused to acknowledge it. But it didn't matter. It knew I could hear it. The first time I saw the shadow, I nearly lost my mind. It was just a flicker at first, a brief movement in the reflection of my television screen. But when I turned, nothing was there. Then, it happened again. In the bathroom mirror, behind the shower curtain. In the window as I passed by at night. A shape standing in the darkness, unmoving, waiting. Every night, it came closer. I started keeping the lights on, refusing to let the darkness settle in. But it didn't care. It didn't need the dark. I woke up one night to the sound of something shuffling across the floor. My breath hitched, and I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, I saw it. A figure, hunched and gaunt, standing at the foot of my bed. My body locked up, every muscle frozen in terror as I felt it watching me. Then, it moved. Not like a person, not even like an animal. It jerked forward in short, unnatural bursts, its limbs contorting as if they weren't fully connected. It leaned in closer, and I could feel the cold emanating from its body. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. That was when I knew. It wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just a memory. I had brought something back with me. That house had let me leave, but I hadn't left alone. And the worst part? I could feel it getting stronger. Each night, it came closer, lingering longer. The whispers became voices. The voices became screams. And then, last night, I woke up to the sound of my front door unlocking. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding as I listened. The knob twisted, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, inch by inch, until the darkness of the hallway stretched before me. My breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, or maybe a break-in, something normal, something explainable. But then I heard it. The same rasping voice I had heard in that house. You came back. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. I just sat there, paralyzed, as the door swung open completely, revealing the long stretch of empty hallway. Or at least, it should have been empty. But it wasn't. At the far end, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, was the figure. Not just a shadow this time. It was real. Tangible. Its pale, stretched face twisted into that awful, jagged grin. And it was waiting. I don't remember how I got through the night. The next thing I knew, it was morning, sunlight streaming through the window, the door still open but no sign of anything else. My body ached, as if I had spent the entire night curled up in fear. But I knew the truth. It wasn't over. It would never be over. And for the first time since I left that house, I realized what I had to do. I had to go back. I had to end this. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't make a plan. I just got in my car and drove, the steering wheel cold and stiff beneath my fingers as the tires ate up the miles of empty road. The sky above was heavy with thick, gray clouds, pressing down like an omen, like a warning I should have heeded. But I knew there was no choice. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to leave. And if I didn't face it now, it would consume me. The road twisted and turned through long stretches of wilderness, the trees looming on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, thick with something I couldn't describe. It wasn't just the weight of dread, it was something else, something alive. Like the very air around me knew where I was going and was trying to press me back. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short bursts, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. When I finally reached the dirt path leading up to the house, my stomach clenched. It looked the same as I had left it. Empty. Abandoned. Wrong. The windows were hollow, gaping like open mouths, the front door slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for me. The trees surrounding the property seemed taller now, their branches twisted in unnatural ways, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. The wind howled through them, a sound too close to whispers, too close to laughter. I stepped out of the car, my legs stiff and unsteady. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last, as if something unseen was pulling at me, trying to stop me from crossing that threshold again. The air was colder here, biting against my skin despite the warmth of the season. My breath came out in visible puffs, the temperature dropping the closer I got. And then, as I reached the doorway, everything went silent. The wind stopped. The rustling leaves froze. Even the distant sound of birds vanished. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I stepped inside. The air inside was thick, stale, filled with the scent of rot and something older, something worse. Dust clung to every surface, but it was disturbed, dragged in streaks and patterns across the floor, as if something had moved through here recently. My footsteps barely made a sound, swallowed up by the oppressive silence pressing down from all sides. I moved forward, deeper into the house, my pulse hammering in my throat. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, coming from the far end of the hall. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't chaotic. It was slow. Deliberate. Like something was waiting for me to come closer. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I knew better. There was no running from this. I stepped forward, my breathing shallow, my hands curled into fists at my sides. The hallway stretched ahead of me, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that seemed to shift in the dim light. Shadows twisted in the corners, stretching unnaturally, moving even though nothing else did. My fingers brushed against the banister as I walked, the wood cold, almost wet, like something breathing just beneath the surface. The sound came again. Closer this time. I turned the corner, and there it was. The basement door. It stood slightly open, a sliver of pure, undisturbed blackness spilling out from the gap. The air was colder here, thick with something putrid, something wrong. I stared at it, my breath coming in ragged bursts. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, to leave, to never step foot in this place again. But I knew that wasn't an option. I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers brushed against the wood, the door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak, revealing the stairs descending into the pitch-black void. The smell hit me in full force now, damp earth, decay, something almost metallic beneath it all. The darkness at the bottom was absolute, swallowing everything beyond the first few steps. I hesitated. Then, from the depths of the blackness, I heard it. A voice. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just, waiting. You came back. My stomach clenched, my throat closing around a silent scream. It was the same voice I had heard in my apartment, the same voice that had whispered from the shadows night after night. But now, it was here. It had been waiting for me. I gripped the banister, forcing my feet to move. Step by step, I descended into the dark. The air grew colder with each step, thick and suffocating, pressing against me like unseen hands. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my weight, each groan echoing into the abyss below. The further I went, the more the darkness seemed to swallow me, the light from above shrinking until it was nothing but a distant memory. Then, I reached the bottom. The floor was dirt, damp and uneven beneath my feet. The walls were stone, rough and cold against my fingertips. I blinked, my eyes struggling to adjust, but the darkness here wasn't natural. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was something else entirely. Something alive. Then, the whisper came again. I've been waiting. My breath hitched, my body locking up as I turned toward the voice. And then, I saw it. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a figure lurking in the dark. It was something worse. Something that shouldn't exist. It stood at the far end of the room, its body impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, its fingers curled inwards like talons. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its frame, gray and pulsing as if something beneath it was trying to break free. And its face was the worst of all. Hollow eyes, blacker than the void around it. A grin that stretched too wide, too jagged, splitting its face like an open wound. It didn't move. It didn't lunge. It just stood there. Watching. And then, it laughed. A low, guttural sound that crawled beneath my skin, burrowing into my bones. It wasn't a human laugh. It was something else. Something ancient. Something hungry. I stepped back, my pulse hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing tighter, suffocating me. The laughter grew louder, echoing in my head, rattling my thoughts, shaking me to my core. Then, it took a step forward. My body finally responded, and I turned, sprinting up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I tore through the suffocating dark. The laughter chased me, stretching through the walls, curling around me like invisible fingers. The moment I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut, throwing my weight against it. The wood groaned, shuddering under an unseen force. Then, silence. The air around me was heavy, charged with something electric, something waiting. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my entire body trembling. The house felt different now. It wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was awake. And it wasn't going to let me leave this time. Story 2. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my mind. It was late, far later than I should have been awake, and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, staring out the window into the inky blackness of the night. The moon was a thin sliver, casting faint shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in ways that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the long hours and lack of sleep were getting to me. But then I heard it again, a soft, almost melodic murmur, so faint it could have been a breath, but unmistakably there. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. I froze, my fingers tightening around the mug. The sound was coming from the hallway, just beyond the kitchen door. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it felt like language, like something trying to communicate. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed in my ears. I wanted to move, to get up and lock the door, but my body refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel them crawling up my spine, wrapping around my throat like icy fingers. And then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air before a storm. I sat there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything, but the house was eerily still. Finally, I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or maybe a draft. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to convince myself that it had been a one-time thing, a trick of my exhausted mind. But the whispers came back. Every night, without fail, they would start just as the clock struck midnight. Soft at first, almost soothing, but growing louder, more urgent, until I felt like I was drowning in them. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what I might hear if I let my guard down. I started leaving lights on, hoping the brightness would keep whatever it was at bay. But it didn't help. If anything, it only made things worse. One night, I decided to confront it. I don't know what came over me, maybe it was the lack of sleep, or the growing sense of dread that had taken root in my chest, but I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. The whispers led me to the basement door, a heavy, wooden thing that I always kept locked. But when I reached for the handle, it turned easily in my hand, the lock broken. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The basement was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. I shone the flashlight down the stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel them pulling me forward, urging me to descend. My legs moved on their own, each step bringing me closer to the source of the sound. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, the sound mingling with the whispers until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When I reached the bottom, the flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering before going out completely. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were all around me now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was no use. And then, in the darkness, I saw it, a faint glow, coming from the far corner of the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I took a step forward, then another, my feet moving of their own accord. The glow grew brighter as I approached, and I could see that it was coming from a small, ornate box, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change in the dim light. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling. The moment my skin made contact with the box, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then the box began to vibrate, a low, steady hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was stuck, as if the box had fused to my skin. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it felt like my entire body was vibrating. And then, with a sudden, violent burst of light, the box opened. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that when I woke up, I was back in my bed, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a horrible, vivid nightmare. But then I saw it, the box, sitting on my nightstand, its surface cold and lifeless. And I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever had been inside it was now free. The whispers haven't stopped. If anything, they've gotten worse. They follow me everywhere, a constant presence in the back of my mind. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something else looking back at me, its eyes dark and empty. I don't know what it wants, or how to stop it. But I know one thing for certain, it's only a matter of time before it takes control. And when it does, I don't think I'll be able to fight back. The whispers have become my constant companions, a relentless chorus that follows me wherever I go. They're no longer confined to the shadows of the house or the stillness of the night. They're in my head now, a cacophony of voices that overlap and intertwine, each one vying for my attention. Some are soft, almost soothing, like a lullaby meant to lull me into a false sense of security. Others are sharp, jagged, like shards of glass scraping against my skull. I can't escape them, no matter how hard I try. They're there when I wake up, when I eat, when I try to work. They're there when I close my eyes, their voices echoing in the darkness behind my eyelids. I've stopped sleeping altogether. The exhaustion is a heavy weight pressing down on me, but the thought of what I might see, or hear, in my dreams is far worse. The box is still on my nightstand. I've tried to get rid of it, to throw it away or bury it somewhere far from here, but every time I try, something stops me. It's like an invisible force, a hand gripping my wrist and pulling me back. The carvings on its surface seem to shift whenever I look at them, forming patterns that I can't quite decipher. They're not random, I know that much. They mean something, something important, but I can't figure out what. And every time I touch the box, even accidentally, the whispers grow louder, more insistent, as if they're trying to tell me something. But I can't understand them. Not yet. The mirror is worse. I've started avoiding it altogether, covering it with sheets or turning it around so I don't have to see what's looking back at me. But sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch a glimpse of it, of him. His eyes are the worst part. They're not human, not really. They're too dark, too deep, like bottomless pits that suck in all the light around them. And they're always watching me, always waiting. I can feel his presence growing stronger every day, like a shadow stretching across my mind. He's patient, I'll give him that. He doesn't rush, doesn't force his way in. He just waits, biding his time until I'm too weak to fight back. And I am getting weaker. I can feel it in the way my hands shake, in the way my thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. It's only a matter of time before he takes over completely. I've started researching, desperate for answers. The internet is a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and half-truths, but I've managed to piece together a few things. The box is old, far older than I initially thought. It's not just a relic, it's a prison. A prison for something that should never have been let out. The carvings are a warning, a ward meant to keep whatever's inside contained. But the lock is broken now, and the wards are fading. I don't know how much time I have left before they fail completely. I've also learned that I'm not the first one this has happened to. There are others, scattered across the world, who have encountered similar boxes. Some of them survived, at least for a while. Their stories are fragmented, buried in obscure forums and forgotten archives, but they all end the same way, with silence. No one knows what happened to them, but I can guess. The whispers got too loud, the presence too strong, and they were consumed. I don't want to end up like that. I can't. But I don't know how to stop it. The house doesn't feel like mine anymore. It's like it's alive, breathing, watching me. The walls seem to close in around me, the air thick and heavy with something I can't quite name. The whispers are louder here, more coherent, as if the house itself is speaking to me. I've started hearing other sounds too, footsteps in empty rooms, the creak of floorboards when no one's there, the faint sound of laughter echoing down the hallways. It's not just the whispers anymore. It's everything. The house is awake, and it knows I'm here. Last night, I tried to leave. I packed a bag, threw on a coat, and headed for the door. But the moment I stepped outside, the whispers turned into screams, a deafening roar that made my knees buckle. The air was thick, almost solid, pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the property, his dark eyes fixed on me. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his presence, a cold, malevolent force that rooted me to the spot. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when I finally managed to stumble back inside, the door slammed shut behind me, the lock clicking into place. I'm trapped here. I don't know if it's the house or him or something else entirely, but I can't leave. Not yet. I've started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures standing in doorways, faces staring at me from the darkness. They're not real, I know that, but they feel real. And they're getting closer. Last night, I woke up to find one standing at the foot of my bed, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. I screamed, but no sound came out. It just stood there, watching me, until I closed my eyes and prayed for it to go away. When I opened them again, it was gone, but the feeling of being watched hasn't left me. It's like they're always there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The box is changing. The carvings are shifting more frequently now, forming patterns that almost make sense. I've started sketching them, trying to piece together what they mean. Some of them look like symbols, ancient and unfamiliar, while others resemble words in a language I don't recognize. I've tried translating them, but nothing makes sense. It's like trying to read a book written in a language that doesn't exist. But I know they're important. They have to be. The whispers grow louder whenever I look at them, as if they're trying to guide me. But to what? And why? I've started losing time. 1 minute, I'll be sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the box, and the next, I'll be standing in the basement, my hands covered in dirt. I don't remember how I got there or what I was doing. The first time it happened, I thought I was sleepwalking, but it's happened too many times now for that to be the case. And each time, I wake up with the feeling that I've done something terrible, something I can't take back. The dirt under my nails, the scratches on my arms, they're proof that I'm not imagining it. But what am I doing? And why can't I remember? The whispers are starting to make sense. At first, they were just noise, a jumble of sounds that didn't mean anything. But now, I can pick out words, phrases, fragments of sentences. They're not in any language I know, but somehow, I understand them. They're telling me to do things, small things at first, like moving objects or drawing symbols on the walls. But they're getting more specific, more demanding. Last night, they told me to dig. I don't know where or why, but I could feel the urgency in their voices, the desperation. I tried to resist, but the pressure in my head was too much. I blacked out, and when I came to, I was in the backyard, my hands raw and bleeding, a hole dug deep into the earth. I don't know what I was looking for, but I didn't find it. Whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting. The presence is stronger now. I can feel him in every corner of the house, his eyes always on me, his voice a constant whisper in my ear. He doesn't speak often, but when he does, his voice is cold, commanding, impossible to ignore. He's been giving me instructions, guiding me through the rituals I've been performing without even realizing it. I don't know what they're for, but I can feel the power building, a dark, oppressive force that seems to pulse through the walls of the house. He's using me, I know that much. But for what? And what happens when he no longer needs me? I've started seeing flashes of memories that aren't mine. They come to me in dreams, vivid and terrifying, like fragments of a life I've never lived. I see a man, his face twisted in agony, his hands bound with chains. I see a woman, her eyes filled with tears, begging for mercy. I see a child, his face pale and lifeless, lying in a pool of blood. They're not just images, they're emotions, raw and unfiltered, flooding my mind until I can't tell where they end and I begin. I don't know who these people are or why I'm seeing them, but I know they're connected to the box, to him. And I know that whatever happened to them, it's my fault. The whispers are getting louder, more insistent. They're not just in my head anymore, they're everywhere, filling the air with their eerie, melodic hum. I can't escape them, no matter how hard I try. They're in the walls, in the floor, in the very fabric of the house. They're part of it now, and so am I. I can feel them pulling me deeper, drawing me into their web. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I don't know if I want to. The box is calling to me. I can feel it, a low, steady pulse that seems to resonate in my bones. It's not just an object anymore, it's alive, a living, breathing thing that knows me better than I know myself. It wants something from me, something I don't think I can give. But I don't have a choice. The whispers are too loud, the presence too strong. I'm losing myself, piece by piece, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. I don't know how much longer I have. The shadows are closing in, the whispers growing louder, the presence stronger. I can feel him in my mind, his cold, calculating thoughts mingling with my own. He's patient, but he's also relentless. He won't stop until he has what he wants. And when he does, I don't know what will happen to me. Will I disappear, consumed by the darkness? Or will I become something else, something worse? I don't have the answers. All I know is that I'm running out of time. The box is still on my nightstand, its carvings shifting and changing, its presence a constant reminder of what's to come. The whispers are louder than ever, their voices a cacophony of fear and desperation. And he's still there, watching me, waiting for the moment when I finally break. I don't know how this ends. But I know it's coming. And when it does, I won't be able to stop it.